The debt wasn't supposed to become famous. That was the point. In Northern Ireland, its operators lived inside the grey space between soldier and civilian, watcher and target, street and safe house. They learned how to follow without looking like they were following, how to sit in a car without becoming part of a pattern, how to read a door, a pub, a face, a route, a silence. But wars change. The troubles didn't last forever. The need for covert surveillance did. After 9/11, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after London began thinking differently about terrorism, the question was no longer whether Britain needed the skills of 14 intelligence company. The question was whether those skills should remain an improvised shadow or become a regiment. The answer was the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. A few weeks ago, a comment appeared under the 14 Intelligence Company video from a viewer going by @Brocklanders6008. The question was simple and sharp. How does the debt actually connect to the SRR? And should it even be called that? Or should it be called the SRS? 7 likes on a question that cuts straight to the heart of something the mainstream military press rarely bothers to disentangle. This episode is the answer. Some of you are coming to this without having seen the prior video, so we need to recap what 14 Intelligence Company actually was. That recap matters for the argument we're making, and it shouldn't take long. In 1972, the British Army had a problem with no clean solution. The Provisional IRA was operating in plain clothes across Northern Ireland, in shops, in pubs, on street corners, in vehicles that looked identical to every other vehicle on the road. Against an urban insurgency that moved through the civilian population the way water moves through sand, the Army's existing intelligence methods were failing. A unit called the Mobile Reconnaissance Force, the MRF, had tried plainclothes surveillance and been burned when IRA members identified its operators and exposed the operation publicly. That failure wasn't simply embarrassing, it was a signal that something more professional, more rigorous, and more deeply concealed was needed. In 1973, the answer arrived in the form of 3 detachments, each established across its own sector of Northern Ireland, corresponding to a British Army brigade area. The unit would accumulate names over the following decades, the way a covert organisation accumulates cover identities. Special Reconnaissance Unit, Special Reconnaissance Squadron, Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Team, Intelligence and Security Group. Eventually, it settled into 14 Intelligence and Security Company, then shortened still further to 14 Intelligence Company. On the street, among those who knew it existed at all, there was one name: the debt. That nickname came directly from the structure. The detachments became the debts, and the unit became the debt. Simple, forgettable, and by design. What 14 Intelligence Company wasn't is at least as important as what it was. Mark Urban, the defence journalist and former military intelligence officer who wrote Big Boys Rules in 1992, was explicit on this point. One of his specific criticisms of other writers was their tendency to mischaracterise 14 Int as an SAS unit. The relationship was real but asymmetric. The unit was selected and initially trained by a dedicated wing of 22 SAS. SAS officers held command positions. An attached SAS troop, together with 14 Intelligence, formed the Combined Intelligence and Security Group in Northern Ireland. But 14 Int operated under separate command and a fundamentally different doctrine. Its operators were surveillance professionals. Their job wasn't to close with and kill. Their job was to watch. The mission was covert surveillance and intelligence gathering against suspected members of the Provisional IRA, the Ulster Loyalist paramilitaries, and their support networks. Operators worked in plain clothes, in unmarked civilian vehicles, in ordinary-looking properties, blending into the social fabric of towns and estates, where any unfamiliar face got noticed, and any unfamiliar car got noted. The physical requirements for selection were unusual in ways that don't appear in standard military fitness assessments. Candidates were required to have no identifiable physical markings, no distinctive tattoos, no prominent scars, nothing that would make them memorable under close inspection by someone who'd had a second look. This wasn't bureaucratic caution, it was operational necessity. An operator with a recognizable tattoo on their forearm couldn't roll up their sleeves in a pub in South Armagh without becoming a detail in someone else's memory. Selection prioritized observational acuity and psychological composure above nearly everything else. Candidates went through loaded marches and sleep deprivation and memory retention exercises that tested whether they could hold a street scene accurately in their heads after leaving it. Clocking the number of people, the way they were dressed, the position of parked cars, who had been looking at what and for how long. They were tested on the ability to navigate under pressure, to maintain cover under erratic schedules, and to sustain mental coherence when everything around them was designed to disorient. The specific stress of this selection wasn't the stress of conventional soldiering. It was the stress of watching under constraint, of taking in everything, reacting to nothing, and filing it all perfectly. James Rennie, a former 14-int operator, published his memoir, The Operators, in 1996. The Imperial War Museum holds it in their collections under the subtitle Inside 14 Intelligence Company, the Army's top secret elite. The IWM catalogue describes it as the inside story of a unit whose members were as highly trained in combat as the SAS and as highly trained in intelligence work as MI5 and MI6. Rennie describes what it actually felt like to be that person, standing in light rain on a wet street, patiently waiting, maintaining the required composure, observing the official discipline of a unit whose interior culture was as rigorous as its operational doctrine. He doesn't describe action. He describes the waiting that precedes it and makes it possible. The sensory register is ordinary almost to the point of tedium. Rain, patience, a street, a face, a door. That ordinariness was the entire point. Sarah Ford's memoir, One Up, and Jackie George's She Who Dared document the experience from the perspective of female DT operators, and the detail they add is worth pausing on. 14 Intelligence Company was the first UK Special Forces unit to admit women to full operational roles, not as a later reform or an ideological concession, but built into the unit from its inception. Female and male operators conducted missions together, frequently posing as couples to reduce suspicion during close surveillance work. A man and a woman sitting in a parked car in a residential street in Belfast are, to anyone looking, a couple. A single man in the same position is something else. Two men are something else again. The mixed gender team had a cover story that no all-male unit could replicate, and 14 Int exploited that advantage from the start. The official Army doctrine at the time was explicit in the opposite direction. The Women's Royal Army Corps rules stated directly that female soldiers wouldn't be employed, in uniform or in plain clothes, as active members of operational or surveillance patrols. They wouldn't carry arms. 14 Intelligence Company deployed women operationally in both capacities and continued doing so, because the operations required it and the capability was there. The restriction was an administrative position, and the unit's results were an operational argument. The operational argument won. One document captures 14 INT's collective self-understanding more precisely than any official history. The memoir Charlie 1, written by an Irish operator embedded in the British intelligence structure during the Troubles, gives the unit's identity in a single line. We are the hidden eyes of British intelligence in Northern Ireland. We are the watchers, not the strikers, not the hunters, not the soldiers. The watchers. That phrase wasn't false modesty. It was a precise description of where the unit sat in the operational architecture and what it took to function there. Beginning in 1977, following the death of Captain Robert Nairac, intelligence resources in Northern Ireland were deliberately moved away from the publicly visible conventional army, the Green Army in Urban's phrase, and concentrated into small covert units. 14 Intelligence Company was the primary instrument of that shift. By the early 1980s, formally integrated alongside an attached SAS troop into the Intelligence and Security Group, it was the indispensable front end of the most significant counter-terrorism operations of that period. Every successful SAS ambush, every vehicle interdiction, every arrest that produced intelligence had a surveillance phase behind it that no press release mentioned. The Det put in the hours that the SAS got the credit for. That was the arrangement, and it worked. The Troubles formally ended on April 10, 1998, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Belfast. 3 decades of low-intensity conflict, thousands of deaths, and an intelligence architecture built specifically around Northern Ireland's geography and politics. And the primary operational mandate had changed fundamentally. What happened to 14 Intelligence Company? Some accounts claim the unit was redesignated as 1 Intelligence Company in the years following the agreement, serving as an intermediate step between the Det and its eventual successor. There is no credible record of an intermediate unit by that name. The documented naming sequence for the organisation runs from Special Reconnaissance Unit through Intelligence and Security Group, through 14 Intelligence and Security Company to 14 Intelligence Company, and then directly to what followed. No intermediate unit with a different number. No rebranding exercise in the late 1990s. Nothing. The lineage is direct. What actually happened is straightforward, but requires attention to the timeline. The Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. The Det didn't immediately stand down. It remained in Northern Ireland for several years through the transition period, as PIRA moved through the formal disarmament process and the security landscape changed incrementally rather than overnight. The unit continued operating in a province that still had dissident Republicans, still had residual threats, still required the kind of surveillance capability that conventional policing and conventional intelligence work couldn't provide. Only when the decision was made to create something larger, more formal, and more broadly applicable did 14 INT's operational existence end. And when it ended by being absorbed into something new rather than simply disbanded. That something new was announced on April 5, 2005, in a written ministerial statement to Parliament by Secretary of State for Defence Geoffrey Hoon. The statement is preserved verbatim in Hansard. It reads, "The Special Reconnaissance Regiment will stand up on the 6th of April 2005. This regiment has been formed to meet a growing worldwide demand for special reconnaissance capability by providing improved support to expeditionary operations overseas and form part of the defence contribution to the government's comprehensive strategy to counter international terrorism. Not a rumour, not a specialist inference, a statement made formally to Parliament under Hoon's name, recorded in Hansard on April 5, 2005. The SRR stood up the following day. Multiple specialist sources confirmed the direct connection to 14 Intelligence Company. Wikipedia's article on the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, drawing on the Daily Telegraph's contemporaneous coverage, states plainly, the regiment was formed around a core of the already established 14 Intelligence Company. Peer-reviewed academic literature is equally direct. One scholarly source describes the SRR as very much the successor of 14 International. Another describes it as formed in 2005 from the legacy of the earlier unit. The same year that the Provisional IRA formally completed its disarmament process, 14 Intelligence Company was disbanded, and its structure, personnel and tradecraft were reorganized into the SRR. The debt didn't inspire the SRR, it became it. The first commanding officer of the new regiment was Tim Radford, a lieutenant colonel who had previously been developing leadership doctrine at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. The SRR held its inaugural parade on September 2, 2005, at an undisclosed location. Its march is Argus, a name that had also served as one of the cover designations used by the earlier unit in its various identities. The continuity wasn't accidental. The regiment inherited not only personnel and tradecraft, but the institutional memory encoded in names. Tuat Brocklander's 6008 second question. Should it be called the SRS rather than the SRR? The Special Reconnaissance Squadron designation was one of the earliest cover names used during 14 INT's formation period in 1973, one of several aliases the unit moved through as it tried to stay invisible. The modern regiment, established in 2005, is and has always been formally designated the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. SRR is correct. The SRS label belongs to a temporary designation from 3 decades earlier, not to the modern unit. But the more consequential question isn't what the unit is called. It's why Britain decided in the early 2000s that the skills of 14 Intelligence Company needed to be formalised into a standing regiment with a permanent structure inside the UK Special Forces Group. That decision was driven entirely by operational necessity. Understand what changed between the late 1990s and 2005. The Good Friday Agreement shifted Northern Ireland from active conflict to managed transition. The specific threat environment that had created and sustained 14 INT, the PIRA campaign, the loyalist paramilitaries, the urban surveillance requirement in Belfast and Derry and South Armagh, was winding down. In theory, a unit designed for that specific context might have been stood down entirely. The SAS continued. The intelligence agencies continued. The conventional army continued. What would a specialised plainclothes surveillance unit add to a post-Troubles landscape? September 11, 2001 answered that question before Britain had finished asking it. Al-Qaeda's attack on the United States changed the calculus of British security planning completely. The threat was no longer primarily domestic and geographically contained. It was international, ideologically motivated, and operated through networks embedded in civilian populations, sometimes in the UK, sometimes in Afghanistan, sometimes in countries where British forces were about to be deployed in large numbers. The intelligence question shifted from confirming who was meeting whom on the Falls Road to locating command nodes inside a dispersed global network operating across multiple continents simultaneously. The formal institutional decision point wasn't a battlefield failure. It was a government document, The 2002 Strategic Defence Review, a new chapter, was published in July 2002 as a direct response to the September 11th attacks. It formally identified the need for a dedicated special reconnaissance capability. The document was reviewed by the Defence Select Committee and is publicly available. Its logic was explicit. The threat from international terrorism required skills that had been developed and refined during the Troubles, applied now to a global rather than a provincial theatre. A military source quoted at the time of the SRR's formation made the connection with unusual candour. "We got very good at doing this in Northern Ireland in the 1980s and 1990s. And now we want to transfer this capability to the global war on terrorism." The skills being referenced, placing technical devices close to targets, developing persistent covert observation without triggering awareness, sustaining surveillance over extended periods in hostile environments, were precisely what 14 Intelligence Company had been practicing for 30 years. The question was whether to keep those skills in an improvised, deniable structure that had grown organically from the specific conditions of Northern Ireland, or to codify them into a permanent institution. There was also an operational bandwidth problem that the SAS and SBS were experiencing by the early 2000s. Both Tier 1 units were being increasingly tasked with ISTAR work, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, because no other unit in the UKSF architecture could reliably perform it. That was consuming capacity needed for direct action, counter-terrorism operations, and the offensive missions for which both regiments were specifically designed and trained. The solution was conceptually straightforward. Create a dedicated surveillance regiment. The SRR would do the watching. The SAS and SBS would do the hitting. Both would do their jobs better. This is the institutional logic behind the SRR, and it tracks exactly with what 14 Intelligence Company had been doing in Northern Ireland for 3 decades. Providing the surveillance-derived intelligence that made SAS operations possible in the first place. The relationship between 14 INT and the SAS in Northern Ireland was already the prototype. The SRR formalised and scaled it for a global operational environment. The SRR's position within the UK Special Forces Group reflects that division of labour. Under the command of the Director of Special Forces, the group includes 22 SAS, the Special Boat Service, the Special Forces Support Group, and the SRR. The regiment is tri-service. It draws personnel from across the British Army, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force. Personnel retain the uniforms of their parent organisations and add the SRR's emerald grey beret and its own cap badge, which, like all UKSF badges, features the sword Excalibur. In the SRR's case, set behind a Corinthian helmet with a scroll inscribed with the single word reconnaissance. The regiment's stated mission in the public domain is special reconnaissance, surveillance and ISTAR support. BBC News coverage on the day of formation described it plainly. The Special Reconnaissance Regiment would provide specialist support for overseas operations, particularly those against international terrorism. The SRR was, by one description in the specialist press, the first new Special Forces regiment established by the British Army since the 1950s. Its personnel establishment in contemporaneous reporting ranged from 300 to 600, with later estimates reaching higher. Several hundred is the honest summary. What is clear is that the unit was large enough to sustain multiple surveillance teams in multiple theatres simultaneously. One claim needs to be corrected directly because it appears in a number of accounts. The 7/7 London bombings of July 2005 are sometimes cited as the event that created the SRR or forced its creation. The SRR stood up on April 6, 2005. The bombings occurred on July 7, 2005, 3 months after the regiment already existed. What 7/7 actually did was validate the decision that had already been made, and in the immediate aftermath, the SRR was reportedly involved in surveillance operations connected to the subsequent investigation, attaching personnel to Metropolitan Police surveillance teams that were seriously overstretched. But 7/7 didn't cause the SRR. The 2002 Strategic Defence Review caused the SRR. The decision came from strategic foresight. The bombings were a consequence that confirmed the reasoning. The Iraq deployment gives the clearest public record evidence of what the SRR actually did and why it mattered. By mid-2006, SRR operators were active in Baghdad as part of Task Force Black, the joint UK-SFJ-SOC operation targeting AQI networks across Iraq. Task Force Black was doing exactly what the Northern Ireland model had done, systematically working through a network, finding the nodes, watching the patterns, and then enabling the assault teams to act decisively when the intelligence was current and confirmed. And the SRR was doing what 14 intelligence had always done, providing the surveillance that made the strike operations possible. Baghdad wasn't South Armagh. The scale was different, the language was different, the geography was different, and the enemy was different. But the operational logic was identical. SRR operators formed Special Reconnaissance Detachments inside Task Force Black. Initially, they met skepticism from other UK SF elements who weren't yet sure what this new regiment could deliver. By mid-2006, that skepticism had largely dissolved. The SRR operators were doing difficult, dangerous surveillance work inside a city where the insurgency was pervasive, where every street corner potentially had eyes on it, and where the intelligence picture changed faster than any static collection system could track. Picture what that work looked like at street level. An operator moves through a Baghdad neighborhood in civilian clothes, in a vehicle that matches the local traffic, without body armor, without a visible weapon, without the posture or the silhouette that marks a soldier. The objective is a building in a block the team has been watching for 11 days. The pattern they've established: a man leaves at 06:30, returns at variable times between 1400 and 1700, never alone. A vehicle arrives 3 times in 9 days, parks for between 40 minutes and 2 hours. There are 2 addresses in the city that show the same vehicle on the same schedule. 11 days of that. Every entry and exit noted, every deviation from the established pattern flagged. The intelligence that emerges from those 11 days is the difference between an assault on the right target at the right moment and an assault on an empty room. That's what the SRR was doing in Baghdad. And before the SRR, it was what 14 INT had been doing in Belfast, in Derry, in Tyrone, in South Armagh, watching and recording and confirming, day after day, until the picture was clear enough to act on. The direct comparison to what 14 INT had done in Northern Ireland is confirmed in specialist sources. The skills and experience gained by the Det in Northern Ireland were passed directly to SRR operatives. Academically, the word used is successor. Organisationally, the word used is formed around a core of. Both are accurate. The tradecraft transferred because the people who carried it transferred with it. Afghanistan, in June 2006, produced the operation that put the SRR's role most clearly on the public record. A combined 16-man team from Sea Squadron Special Boat Service and the SRR carried out Operation Ilois, a covert mission to capture 4 Taliban commanders in compounds on the outskirts of Sangin in Helmand province. The team went in without notifying the broader Helmand battle group because the operation required the kind of close secrecy that wide notification would have compromised. They secured the targets. Then, on withdrawal, they were ambushed by an estimated 60 to 70 Taliban fighters. One vehicle was disabled by RPG fire. The team went to ground in an irrigation ditch and called for assistance while holding off the ambush. The Gurkha Quick Reaction Force that responded ran into a second ambush en route. A US A-10 and 2 RAF Harrier GR-7s eventually broke the contact. When the team reached the forward operating base, 2 men were missing. An Apache crew located the bodies. A parachute regiment company recovered them. That operation is worth dwelling on not because of the ambush, but because of what the operation itself required before the ambush happened. Getting inside those compounds, confirming the targets were the right people, understanding the layout well enough to move through it and emerge with 4 captives without the situation becoming a massacre. That required close target reconnaissance of the kind that 14 Int had practiced in Northern Ireland. The SRR wasn't watching from distance on Operation Ilois. It was inside the objective. The distinction between surveillance and direct action is real, but the risk involved in the surveillance role at that level isn't smaller than the assault. It's, in some respects, larger, because the operator is alone, or in a small team, in a denied environment without the protection of numbers or announced military presence. Northern Ireland itself came full circle in March 2009 when Chief Constable Sir Hugh Orde told the Northern Ireland Policing Board that he had formally requested the SRR's deployment to help gather intelligence on dissident Republicans. The dissidents, groups that had rejected the Good Friday Agreement and continued violence at a reduced level against police and military targets, were exactly the kind of networked, embedded threat that 14 Int had been created to monitor. The regiment that had grown directly from 14 Int's Northern Ireland roots was being called back to do Northern Ireland work against Northern Irish targets under a 2009 legal framework that required full accountability to civilian oversight. Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams objected. Ian Paisley Jr. said the SRR posed no threat to any community. The deployment went ahead. By April 2011, an SRR surveillance team had spent 3 weeks tracking a 4-man Óglaigh na hÉireann cell in London, watching them photograph the Olympic Stadium and key infrastructure, and feeding the intelligence to the Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command. The surveillance culture had not only transferred, it had come home, and then it had gone back on deployment to the same streets it had started on. Here is what connects all of this into a single, sustained argument. Surveillance isn't the preparation for special operations. It's the first and most consequential phase of them. The doctrinal framework that UK and Allied forces formalised in the post-9/11 period is sometimes called find, fix, finish, or, in UK military terminology, find, fix, strike. Its appearance in UK Parliamentary Defence Committee evidence confirms it as formal doctrine. The critical information requirement throughout the find, fix and finish spectrum of operations, not a journalistic shorthand. In its cleanest form, find the target, establish their precise location and pattern of activity, then strike. 3 phases: The third is the one that generates news coverage, medal citations, and the cultural mythology of special operations. The first two are what make the third possible. What the framework makes plain, if you look at it operationally rather than cinematically, is that find is where everything either works or fails. A raid on the wrong address is worse than no raid at all. It burns the surveillance investment, alerts the network, and may kill innocent people. A raid on a correct address, 6 hours after the target left, is a failure. A raid that succeeds does so because someone confirmed, recently and with high confidence, that the target was there, that the pattern was consistent with the intelligence picture, and that the timing was right. The confirmation isn't the prologue to the decisive act, it's the decisive act. The decision to commit an assault team, which is irreversible once it goes, depends entirely on the quality of the surveillance that authorized it. A US military study on ISR in special operations found that tracking and confirming a single high-value network required more than 600 hours of persistent intelligence collection before a decisive strike was viable. 600 hours. That figure comes from the actual operational record of tracking a target through a networked insurgent environment. The kind of granular, sustained, unglamorous work that produces no visible outputs until the raid happens, and then gets credited to the raid. 600 hours of an operator in a vehicle or at an observation point, or working a technical device, watching and recording and confirming before the helicopters land. The raid takes minutes. The work that makes the raid possible takes months. Think about what those 600 hours actually look like, not as a statistic, but as a human experience. A two-person team in a vehicle, working 4-hour rotational watches over a 3-week period. The same street, the same entrance, the same faces, appearing in the same sequence, with occasional deviations that get flagged and logged. The operator, who has been on that street for day 11, is carrying in his head a detailed picture of everyone who has entered the building, everyone who has left, every vehicle that has stopped outside, every instance where the pattern changed and what the change might mean. Nothing he observes gets immediately acted on. The entire value of his work is in the cumulative confirmation, the picture that builds across days until it's detailed enough, current enough, and confident enough to authorize something irreversible. That is the skill, not the speed, not the aggression, the patience and the accuracy. This is what 14 Intelligence Company had been practicing in Northern Ireland since 1973. In a confined urban and rural theatre, against an adversary that was deeply embedded in local communities and acutely suspicious of surveillance, the DETS operators did exactly this work, confirming patterns of life, building the intelligence picture, enabling SAS operations that would have been impossible without the surveillance foundation beneath them. Mark Urban documented the shift from 1977 onward. Intelligence resources in Northern Ireland were switched away from the visible army and concentrated in small covert units because the mission required it. The recognition wasn't tactical improvisation, it was doctrinal evolution. You can't defeat a guerrilla organization that looks like a civilian population by looking like an army. You have to look like the civilian population yourself. You have to watch the way they watch. The SRR carries that doctrine into a global operational environment. The techniques evolved, the environments changed, the technology available changed, the scale of operations changed, but the core identity is unchanged. Before a door opens, someone has to know which door to open. Before a target is fixed, someone has to find them. Before a raid is authorized, someone has to confirm that the intelligence is current, that the pattern matches the assessment, that the picture justifies the risk. That someone, in the current UK Special Forces architecture, is the SRR. Surveillance constantly has to be argued for in the public discourse around special operations, even in an era when find, fix, finish is doctrine, and 600-hour ISR commitments are a standard operational input. The surveillance phase gets treated as the lesser work, the background, the enabler, the thing that happened before the real story started. That asymmetry is almost entirely a product of visibility. A successful strike on a high-value target produces images, statements, medal citations, and documentary footage. The surveillance that made the strike possible produces a report that says the target was confirmed at the location. The distribution of attention follows the distribution of drama. The work that looks most like victory gets credited as victory. 14 Intelligence Company understood this from the beginning. Its operators knew they were the hidden component in operations that would be attributed to others. That institutional self-understanding, we are the watchers, not the strikers, wasn't false modesty or an institutional grievance. It was an accurate description of the architecture. And the SRR inherited it, along with everything else. The public confusion about the SRR flows from exactly this dynamic, amplified by the gravitational pull of the SAS brand. Pick up almost any mainstream media reference to the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, and it falls into one of two framings. Either the SRR is described as the new SAS, implying it's simply another assault unit with a different name, or it's treated as a surveillance arm so nebulously classified that it barely warrants description. Both miss the point by roughly the same distance in different directions. The SRR is a specialized military unit that conducts the close, covert human terrain work that makes the SAS's job possible. Not a substitute SAS, not a passive intelligence collection bureau. The dedicated finder that enables the striker. The functional distinction is clear enough in the public record. The SAS and SBS are the strikers. Direct action, counter-terrorism, hostage rescue, offensive operations. The SRR is the finder. Close target reconnaissance, covert surveillance, target development, ISTAR support to the Tier 1 units. Both roles are special forces roles. They require different skills, different selection profiles, different psychological temperaments. Conflating them misrepresents what the SRR does and why it exists as a separate institution. You don't build a regiment to do something another regiment already does. You build one because the requirement is distinct enough, demanding enough, and important enough to justify a permanent, dedicated institution. Part of the reason for the conflation is structural. The SAS carries enormous weight in the UK's cultural understanding of special operations. Urban noticed the pattern in the 1990s. Operations involving 14 INT were frequently attributed to the regiment, even when the SAS's role was supporting rather than primary. That habit transferred to the SRR without adjustment. When British Special Forces appear in news coverage, the SAS brand fills the frame by default. The SRR's own reticence doesn't help. Its activities are exempt from freedom of information requests under the blanket that covers all UK Special Forces. The regiment doesn't brief journalists. Its operations surface years after the events through parliamentary questions or specialist defence publications. For a unit whose operational concept depends on not being visible, public invisibility is a feature. But it creates a vacuum, and familiar brands fill vacuums. The mislabeling also reflects a deeper misunderstanding of what elite military capability actually looks like. The popular imagination tends to equate elite performance with maximum violence delivered at maximum speed. The SRR represents something different. Elite performance as the sustained capacity to watch without being seen, to gather without triggering awareness, to confirm before committing. In some respects, that is harder than direct action. It requires a specific psychological architecture, the ability to maintain a cover identity under sustained proximity to the target, to resist the impulse to act when action would blow everything, to stay in position when the threat is immediately in front of you and everything in your training says respond. James Rennie's The Operators makes this concrete, not through dramatic set pieces, but through the texture of the work, the patience required, the maintenance of posture and routine, the specific kind of discipline that surveillance demands. Sarah Ford's and Jackie George's accounts add the dimension of gender to this picture. Female operators in 14 INT weren't doing a softened version of the surveillance mission. They were doing the same mission, in the same environments, facing the same risks, in an institutional context that officially said they shouldn't be there at all. The operational argument for mixed-gender teams was straightforward. A man and a woman are a couple. A couple fits into almost any ordinary environment. An all-male team in a residential street at 10 in the morning is a detail that gets noticed. The tradecraft advantage of gender integration was real, and 14 INT had been using it from 1973. The SRR retained it. Several comments under the 14 INT video raised two figures from the Northern Ireland intelligence world that are genuinely connected to this history and frequently confused with it. Captain Robert Nairac and the Force Research Unit. Robert Nairac was a British Army captain captured and killed by the IRA on May 14, 1977 in South Armagh. He wasn't a 14 Intelligence Company operator. The most precise account of his role describes him as a military liaison officer attached to 14 Intelligence Company, which is a specific and significant distinction. He was working alone in a pub, apparently outside his authorised area of operations, in a capacity that the unit's own structure was designed to prevent. 14 international operators worked in teams with backup under strict protocols. The individual operating without proper support in a known hostile environment was the vulnerability that 14 INT's team-based structure was built to eliminate. Nairac's death is cited in the literature not as an example of how the unit operated, but as a cautionary illustration of what happened when those protocols weren't followed. The Force Research Unit is different again. The FRU was an agent handling organisation. It recruited and ran informers and agents within the paramilitary organisations themselves. The distinction from 14 Intelligence is stated directly in the source material. Undercover operations in the community were 14 Intelligence's remit, not the FRU's. The FRU ran human sources inside the organisations. 14 INT conducted external covert surveillance of suspects from the outside. Different methods, different legal accountability frameworks, different operational risks. The FRU's most notorious case involved Brian Nelson, a UDA intelligence officer who was simultaneously an FRU agent, the kind of deep penetration of a paramilitary organisation that was never 14 INT's mission. Both units contributed to the intelligence picture in Northern Ireland. They contributed very different things. What the SRR inherited from 14 Int was the specific tradecraft of external covert surveillance, the plainclothes capability, the patient observation methods, the ability to watch from within a civilian environment without becoming part of its pattern. Not agent running, not deep cover infiltration, not the complex institutional politics of the Troubles-era intelligence architecture. The watching, the patient, methodical, technically demanding art of watching. The DET taught Britain that sometimes the decisive act isn't kicking in the door, it's knowing which door matters. The SRR exists in that lesson. It's the formal shape of a skill learned the hard way in Northern Ireland. Watch long enough, quietly enough, and carefully enough, and the battlefield starts to reveal itself before anyone fires a shot. That is why the story of 14 Intelligence Company does not end with the Troubles. It changes name, changes structure, and keeps watching. If this kind of institutional history is what you come here for, subscribe. More of this is coming.